Allied aid to Ukraine has no doubt been one of the decisive factors in the war so far, and objectively speaking, there has been a massive change in that aid over time. Those changes have gone a long way to closing some of the military capability gaps between Ukraine and Russia. For the Ukrainians, massive challenges still obviously remain, particularly in the area of quantity. But aid so far does seem to have put them in a position to consider seizing the military initiative. Every new system provided has given Ukraine more options or imposed greater costs on Russia. But every step has likewise been met with fears of uncontrolled escalation. As debates raged over any particular package of sanctions or a new system to be provided to Ukraine, you could bet that there were figures in the Russian government or Russian media playing up fears that that decision might cross a red line, cause a war between NATO and Russia, or bring the world to the brink of a nuclear apocalypse. That sort of messaging, intended to amp up fears of uncontrolled escalation, essentially implies that Ukraine's allies should accept all of the negative consequences that would come from a defeat in Ukraine, in order to avoid a far worse fate in the form of a nuclear war. And whether that threat was credible or not, this kind of rhetoric does seem to have given some of Ukraine's allies pause. And so Ukraine's allies have been left navigating a strategic challenge that would be very familiar to those who operated throughout the Cold War: how to achieve their objectives and give Ukraine what it needs to succeed, while also avoiding a truly uncontrolled escalation towards a global catastrophe. Which means I have good reason today to look at the theory and practice of escalation management in Ukraine, and ask the question of how one inflicts a strategic defeat on a nuclear-armed power, without triggering a proverbial global game over screen. To do so, I'm going to start with some historical parallels, because this is certainly not the first time in history that a nuclear power has found itself fighting an opponent armed by an opposing power bloc. Then I'm going to look at some traditional theory around escalation, the escalation ladder, the concept of escalation dominance, and some of the game theory-esque elements that can go into these decisions. Then I'm going to use that theory to look at how Ukraine's allies have steadily escalated the aid provided, while also trying to minimize the risk of uncontrolled escalation. I'll pair that with an examination of how Russia has responded every time the West has chosen to escalate the aid provided, and why that response has usually been the strategic equivalent of using bravado to cover for the fact that they back down. Having looked at how both Ukraine's allies and Russia have responded to escalations in aid and support so far, I'll close out by looking a little bit at how aid and support to Ukraine is evolving, where we should expect it to go from here, why further escalation may be the best available path to a peace, and what residual risks remain on the table in terms of nuclear escalation. Okay, so let's open here with a few historical examples, because this present scenario where one power bloc is providing aid to a third party, with the intention of frustrating the aggressions or interests of a strategic rival, is not new. Because war has always been potentially dangerous and potentially very expensive, diplomatically, politically, and in terms of lives and treasure. And so there have always been times where it makes sense for powers to pay someone else to do your war stuff for you. In a medieval context, that might take the form of a king backing a rebellious vassal in a neighbouring kingdom just to cause trouble. And sometimes it just made sense from the standpoint of some higher level of competition. There was a time in history, for example, where if you were at least vaguely anti-Napoleon, then a British gentleman would probably turn up offering you a bunch of arms and funds, courtesy free delivery of His Majesty's Royal Navy. In the interwar years, every time you found a communist movement, you'd probably also find Soviet funding and support. Similarly, fascist leaders and movements, like Franco in Spain, could potentially expect to see support from countries like Germany and Italy. And often this could occur without opposing sides ever coming to blows. Germany and the Soviet Union, for example, would back opposing sides in the Spanish Civil War, but they didn't end up going to war over the struggle, far from it. Instead, they'd actually end up signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the same year that the Spanish Civil War ended. But in the early 20th century, this concept of fighting using aid or through proxies exists because it is a practical solution, not because it is the only one theoretically available. And that's because as late as World War II, escalation arguably works differently than it does between great powers today. During World War II, it was possible for great powers to escalate until they were deploying the total sum of all of their available industrial and human resources. This is a state commonly known as total war, where all of society and its resources are turned towards the goal of victory. And in that scenario, if no one's will to continue faltered, or no one broke down and agreed a negotiated settlement, then it was possible for a war to simply continue until one party was completely occupied or destroyed. I've often heard it said that all wars ultimately end at the negotiating table, which I think as a historical statement is just objectively untrue. Germany in World War II didn't negotiate a peace, it surrendered unconditionally. At a point where its industrial base was shattered, its leader had shot himself, the Soviet flag was flying over the Reichstag, and most of German territory was by that point occupied or soon to be occupied. Japan too would surrender unconditionally, having thrown all of the resources it had at the problem, because in the end that total employment of resources wasn't sufficient to stop the bombs raining down, ships being sunk, and the military situation inevitably continuing to deteriorate. And if you go back further through history, you'll see that this was not a distinctly 20th century phenomenon. History is replete with examples of situations where wars ended not with a negotiated settlement, but instead with territory occupied and the population deported, enslaved, massacred, or subjugated. But then human beings had to go and invent something called the atomic bomb. And over time it became clear that that total war calculus would have to change, at least for serious nuclear-armed powers dealing with each other. Because while early Cold War nuclear arsenals may not have posed a civilization-ending threat, by the mid and late Cold War they arguably had the capacity to threaten all of human civilization as we currently know it. The top of the escalation ladder was now mutually assured destruction, where both sides would decisively and unreversibly lose. Now, of course, that didn't stop planners throughout the Cold War continuing to plan to fight and potentially, in inverted commas, win an all-out nuclear war. After all, this is an era which gave us quotes like this one by General Thomas Power, former head of Strategic Air Command, who at one point is reported to have said that if at the end of the war there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian left, we win. To which Professor William Kaufman is reported to have said, well, you'd better make sure they're a man and a woman. I mean, seriously, for those of you out there who are interested in never being able to sleep peacefully again for the rest of your life, I would seriously encourage you to read as much as possible about Cold War nuclear planning. But while a number of generals were planning to fight and win a nuclear war, most, including the political class in both the US and the Soviet Union, seemed to have understood that an all-out nuclear war was too catastrophic a prospect to truly be countenanced. At the same time, no one was particularly keen on the solution of just getting along. The atomic bomb didn't make it impossible for the United States and Soviet Union to win battles of international competition and influence. That'd be like saying it's impossible for Tesla to dominate the electric vehicles market just because they're not allowed to firebomb Toyota and Volkswagen's factories. And so instead, the great powers look for other ways to fight each other's interests without actually fighting each other, which is one of the reasons why the Cold War era is so rife with proxy conflicts. The wars in Korea and Vietnam illustrate some of the Soviet approach to this style of competition. And indeed, you could argue that in some ways, Korea helped set the rules, if you can call them that, for this sort of support and war by proxy. The Soviet Union helped keep North Vietnam supplied, particularly with things like anti-aircraft missiles that domestic industry would have had no hope of producing themselves. And in the Korean War, Soviet pilots actively participated in combat flights against UN forces. And yet the US and its allies chose not to escalate the matter with the Soviet Union. The United States would also return the favour on a number of occasions, most famously in Afghanistan in the 1980s. In the initial stages, US aid to the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet occupiers was intended to be subtle. It took the form of material that could hypothetically at least have just been captured from the Soviet Union or smuggled in from other sources. But at a certain point, the decision was made that deniability wasn't that important anymore, because otherwise it would be kind of hard to come up with a story to explain why some fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan suddenly got their hands on a bunch of, at the time, very advanced Stinger manpads. Afghanistan is famous for a great many things, but it is not blessed with an abundance of Raytheon manufacturing facilities. So the Soviets, and indeed the wider world, were very clear on what the US and its allies were doing. But the decision was made not to escalate regardless. And while the exact role of foreign aid in the outcome of that war is still very much debated, the result was an unambiguous strategic defeat for the Soviet Union, just as the United States and France had both lost in Vietnam. I've often heard it argued that it's impossible to defeat a nuclear-armed power like Russia because they will inevitably escalate to nuclear use in order to stave off defeat. And the 20th century was filled with examples where nuclear powers chose to accept strategic defeat rather than escalate. And indeed, Afghanistan alone has claimed its fair share of superpower scalps throughout history. And to help understand why, it probably helps to look at some theory around the escalation ladder and escalation in general. Keeping in mind that, as usual, I'm going to be pushing the boundaries somewhat in how far this stuff can be simplified. To help understand what an escalation scenario might look like, let's start with a scenario where two sides have their own objectives, and those objectives are mutually incompatible. Let's say, for example, both Kiwiland and Emutopia want control of the same small island in the ocean between them. At any given stage in the crisis, both sides have a number of choices available to them. They could, for example, accept whatever conditions the other side is currently offering, or they could escalate somehow to apply more pressure and encourage the other side to change their position. Kiwiland might threaten to impose trade sanctions, for example, and then Emutopia would have the choice to either back down or accept those sanctions and ratchet up the pressure some way else. Maybe that would be their own trade sanctions, or maybe it would be physically deploying troops to the disputed island and occupying it. In an idealized sense, every time one side chooses to escalate, it imposes costs on both sides. Trade sanctions, for example, would cut both ways. Deploying the military has costs in doing so. But the idea is that those costs are probably asymmetric. One side is going to lose more than the other, and as a result, one side is going to get an advantage in the overall negotiations by choosing to escalate the crisis. This is where we get the concept of an escalation ladder, where a country can choose to step by step use more and more extreme methods that carry with them, generally speaking, heavier and heavier costs in an effort to try and place more pressure on an opponent and improve the chance of a victory or a win scenario. A classic example of an escalation ladder would be the one put together by RAND strategist Herman Kahn in 1965. This model sets out 44 distinct escalation stages for a crisis between nuclear-armed opponents, with each group or family of steps being separated by an implicit or explicit taboo or prohibition. For example, the lowest levels of actions are things that are pretty much purely symbolic. They don't actually threaten to rock the boat or change the strategic picture. Examples at this level would be things like diplomatic announcements or shitposting on Twitter. Cross that threshold and you're into the area where you can threaten, harass, maybe potentially mobilize, but you're not actually going to risk a conventional war. Make the expensive decision to escalate again, and maybe you're now fighting a conventional war where there's an understanding that neither side will use nuclear weapons, but your troops are now engaged directly in combat. Eventually, it's logical that one side or the other is probably going to be losing and faces a choice of try and negotiate and back down, or deploy nuclear weapons, escalate and try and regain some sort of advantage. And from there, you can steadily climb the nuclear war ladder, from demonstrative warning shot strikes in peripheral areas, to attacks on military units, to attacks in the core territory of your opponent, to the point where someone finally crosses the threshold of directly threatening the opposing nuclear forces and eventually potentially targeting cities. At the top of Kahn's ladder is a state called spasmodic or insensate war. This is essentially a state where the nervous system, the government, the command systems on both sides have been totally or effectively destroyed. The leadership on both sides is probably dead, systems have destroyed, but the orders have gone out to launch everything. As you can probably imagine, that level of escalation includes prohibitive general costs that apply to both sides. But while this is a useful model, I'd argue this sort of escalation ladder probably oversimplifies how these things can be handled, and it puts a lot of focus on military measures. Instead, especially when we're talking about something like Ukraine, I think it might be more useful to think about multiple parallel escalation ladders existing at the same time, covering different areas like sanctions or military aid. And on each of these ladders, countries can move independently. For example, let's just say tomorrow the United States was to say, we're not going to be shipping any more free weapons to Ukraine. That would be a step down an escalation ladder. But if at the same time they declared they were going to hand over $500 billion worth of economic aid to the Ukrainians, I don't think it would be right to say they had de-escalated overall just because economic assistance is lower on the general escalation ladder than military assistance. The Ukrainians themselves probably wouldn't feel particularly hard done by, especially as they began sending buyers delegations around the world and asking what the quoted price was for literally all of that country's military equipment. So instead in Ukraine, I think there's at least 3 ladders in play: economic assistance and sanctions, the capability types, that is, what sort of weapons the Allies are willing to provide Ukraine, and also the permissible use ladder, which is the rules that govern how those weapons are used. Then underpinning all of this, of course, is the quantum, that is, how much of any given level of aid is provided, and what impact that ultimately ends up having on Russia and Ukraine. Along with the idea of an escalation ladder, it's helpful to understand the idea of escalation dominance. To paraphrase the original Khan version, escalation dominance is a capacity, all else being equal, to enable the side possessing it to enjoy a market advantage in a given region of the escalation ladder. In other words, a country might have a major advantage at one or more points on the ladder. If you're a country with incredible spies and propagandists but a dogshit army, then an opponent with a powerful military is going to enjoy a position of dominance if you ever let a situation escalate to the point of conventional war. And so you might have a pretty strong incentive for whatever side is disadvantaged at those higher levels to avoid the situation escalating to that point. But hey, let's see if we can use an example to illustrate some of these ideas. Let's just say two blokes, Dave and Ricky, are getting beers at halftime at a sporting match. They both go for opposing sides and tempers are running pretty high. If you're Australian, I'm thinking state of origin since it's going on at the moment. But if you're international, feel free to substitute any other sporting scenario that has approximately the same relationship between the teams as a Croatia-Serbia soccer match. Two blokes see the other guy wearing the other colour, they've had a few bevs already, and so to the gentle encouragement of the crowd around, they both start gently sledging each other. And even though Ricky and Dave definitely do not know it, they've now found themselves in a real-world escalation ladder. If they'd both just left well enough alone, they would have found themselves in a draw with no general consequences. But honour, bravado, or testosterone is on the line, so they're going to have a go at it. At a low stage on the escalation ladder, it might just be trading a few barbs back and forth. Nothing anyone hasn't heard before, and nothing that's going to cause much in the way of general consequences. Maybe a gentle, pipe it down, please, from any officials that are nearby. However, Dave-O here quickly realises that he has the advantage. Because Dave turns out to be a comedian by trade, so biting invective is kind of something he does. Ricky, meanwhile, he's a bricklayer with a pretty thick skin, but he doesn't tear people down verbally for a living, so he struggles to match his opponent. Now, seeing he's got the advantage, Dave might choose to escalate with increasingly creative material. That might risk a general consequence, which is potentially being banned from the bar or the match in general, but it might allow him to really put the verbal boot in, presumably to the cheers or approval of some of those nearby. However, at this point, Dave has a problem. Because Ricky, even though he's in a bad place right now, enjoys a situation of escalation dominance if this goes any further. Dave hasn't worked out since high school sport 25 years ago, while Ricky bears at least a passing resemblance to a main battle tank. Which means if Dave ever crosses a red line, if he ever pushes it too far to the point where Ricky is willing to risk potential police involvement to just take a swing at this guy, then Dave is probably going to be unceremoniously and near instantly destroyed. And so Dave ends up having to be more cautious, not using his advantage to the fullest, because he knows that advantage will disappear in an instant if his opponent ever believes that escalation is worth the cost involved. To complete the escalation ladder logic, if Rick does decide to give Dave a bit of a shove, then he's suddenly winning, but he's got a strong incentive not to take it too far. Because if Dave takes the L and walks away, that's one thing. But if he feels afraid for his life and like he has no other choice, he might do something monumentally stupid, like reach for a broken bottle or something. And at that point, the odds are everyone is ending up in a prison cell, the hospital, or both. The generalised costs and risks are just too high. Escalations might be a useful way to think about state behaviour in a crisis. But there's a few obvious caveats to think about when you're trying to analyse a situation in this way. One key point is that you probably need to be as holistic as possible, not just mechanical, when you're evaluating who has the advantage at any given level of escalation. Because even though one side might have more relevant tools, capability, or firepower at its disposal, if the willingness to absorb losses or exert force is sufficiently asymmetrical, an advantage for one side might flip into an advantageous situation for the other. The famous Ho Chi Minh quote about the fighting in Vietnam comes to mind, that he would lose 10 men for every one lost by his opponent, but in the end, it would be his opponent who would tire of it first. Similarly, the Argentinian invasion of the Falkland Islands in the 80s makes absolutely no sense from an escalation ladder perspective if you don't factor politics and will into account. The United Kingdom enjoyed massive escalation dominance. It had the stronger military and, most importantly, It had nuclear weapons and Argentina didn't. Hypothetically, Thatcher could have started slinging nukes with very little risk of being nuked in return, although the political, diplomatic and economic fallout would no doubt have been immense. The key point was that even though Britain might have had the means to escalate, many in the Argentinian leadership seemed to have calculated that Britain would not in fact choose to escalate if the islands were taken. Instead, they reasoned Britain would negotiate once presented with a fait accompli. Now obviously, they turned out to be very, very wrong, which highlights another potential problem with an escalation ladder model. And that is that you may have a situation where there's some information asymmetry or two sides simply see the situation differently. You might think, for example, that you have more than enough military power to deter your opponent. But if the opposing leadership mistakenly believes that their dogshit army is actually the best thing ever and hasn't had all of its equipment worn down by corruption and its institutions rotten from the inside out, then perhaps even though they should hypothetically be deterred by the risk of escalation, they may choose to escalate regardless. The core point is that assessing military or economic advantage at any given escalation level is more complicated than just counting systems or calculating economic might. There are costs, barriers, and limits on escalation which may apply differently to both parties. If you don't factor those realities in, you'll struggle to explain why superpowers lose wars and indeed seem to lose them all the time. In theory, at least, the US could have further escalated in Vietnam, but it chose to withdraw instead. The Russians in the First Chechen War were fighting over an area that the Russian government asserted was an intrinsic part of the Russian Federation, their core territory. And yet there, they accepted a defeat and signed an agreement, even though militarily there were still some admittedly unpalatable options for escalation still on the table. So remember that even though a power might have a theoretical ability to escalate, that doesn't necessarily mean they have the will or the practical ability to do so. So what happens when you try and take theories around escalation management and apply them to a situation like the war in Ukraine? And particularly the kind of dilemmas that Ukraine's allies might face when they're trying to make decisions around whether or not to provide some new sort of military assistance or aid. In the context of this presentation, when talking about escalation risk, I'm going to split aid into three different categories. Economic aid, like concessional loans or grants to the Ukrainian government, exists to sustain the Ukrainian economy under wartime conditions. They need a certain amount of it each month in order to pay to keep the government running. The primary driver of how much will be required is how long the war lasts, and it's essentially a ticket to play. If Ukraine doesn't receive at least a certain amount, it can't continue to provide services or operate the way that it does. Humanitarian aid, meanwhile, reduces the suffering caused by the war to the populations involved. That might be food or medical care for people in Ukraine, for refugees in Europe, or it might be support for the Ukrainian agricultural sector to make sure people don't go hungry in grain-importing countries in Africa. This obviously reduces the suffering caused by the war, but doesn't do much really to affect its outcome or its duration. The final component would be military aid, stuff that enables the Ukrainian military to build its capabilities and to fight harder. Military aid is probably one of the biggest drivers of what the final outcome of this war will be and how long it lasts. Because all else being equal, the more military power Ukraine has, the more capable it will be of achieving its objectives and the stronger its negotiating hand with Russia will be. But even though all these categories of aid are useful, the degree to which countries are comfortable with each of them differs greatly. The Japanese government, for example, bound by its pacifist norms and constitution, is far more comfortable sending economic aid by the billion as opposed to sending military aid. The German public have a massive appetite for supporting Ukrainian refugees or humanitarian causes. They're also very comfortable sending things like air defense systems. But the polling I've seen suggests they do get a bit nervous when you start talking about things like air-launched cruise missiles. On completely the opposite end of the spectrum, you have American public opinion, where there are strong majorities for everything from fighter jets to main battle tanks. But opinion is somewhat cooler when it comes to just sending cash. Essentially, if US public opinion was a person and you asked them for GoFundMe money to buy a used car to help you drive to work, they'd probably tell you no, but when you got home you'd find an ex-US Army MRAP parked in your driveway. Each type of aid has its own distinct strategic role. And any time aid or assistance significantly changes, you can think of that as a step up the relevant escalation ladder, with all the potential risks that might entail. To illustrate that point, let me introduce you to this wonderful diagram here, the Perun escalation minefield. This shows each of the different sorts of aid or initiatives, starting at escalation level 0 on the far left, so no aid or assistance of any kind, with the measures becoming more and more intense as you move further to the right. Now, in most situations, the goal probably isn't the maximum possible escalation. No one wants to give Ukraine nuclear weapons or the keys to the European Central Bank. But you probably do want to escalate at least enough that you achieve the desired impact on the decision-making of your opponent, which for purely illustrative purposes I've marked with that second white line. So if this was just a game, the goal is pretty simple: get from the left to the target state on the right, and your odds of winning are going to improve. But every time you choose to escalate, there's a chance your opponent will respond. And as indicated by those little question mark landmines, you can never be exactly sure how they'll do so. And in particular, when you're dealing with a nuclear power, you're probably going to be very concerned as to where their line for nuclear escalation happens to be on the table. Now, if you're dealing with a completely rational power, that point of nuclear escalation is probably going to be far off to the right, well beyond your target state. Because using a nuclear weapon would have some pretty terrible consequences, risking nuclear war could have some catastrophic consequences, and so a perfectly rational country, be it Russia or some other power, has usually historically chosen to accept a strategic defeat rather than risk escalating to that level. And if you're 100% confident that that's the case, then you can easily and safely escalate up to your target state. Send in the F-16s, the air-launched cruise missiles, amp up the training packages, you name it. Unfortunately, however, human beings are not perfectly rational, and human beings tend to be the ones running countries, at least until our AI overlords take over. Meaning there is always some small danger that one of those escalation landmines is concealing an irrationally devastating counter-escalation. And to be fair, Russia has done several things to try and create a latent fear of uncontrolled escalation from the very first week of the full-scale invasion. When Vladimir Putin, for example, announced on the 28th of February that he was putting Russia's nuclear forces on special alert, that doesn't really appear to have meant anything in a military sense. But it did help hype up fears in the West around a potential nuclear escalation. Statements like that helped create a fear in states, not just in governments, but also in popular discourse, that if countries perhaps went too far, crossed a line in supporting Ukraine, that it might lead to Russia attacking NATO or using nuclear weapons, which is something most sane people obviously would want to avoid. Now, on one hand, those sort of fears might put a government in a difficult position. You have a state with a large arsenal of nuclear weapons actively invading a neighbour, with its leader making statements like, "Whoever tries to hinder us in Ukraine will see consequences you have never seen in your history." So if we go back to our escalation minefield, now there's a chance that if we just YOLO the escalation ladder, we might end up tripping over a terribly placed irrational nuclear escalation, leaving someone to explain to future generations why they have to live in a live-action Fallout game, because one autocrat panicked and overreacted. And so some might argue the only option is to just not escalate at all, to avoid anything that might possibly be interpreted by anyone as a tripwire for even the most non-credible of nuclear threats. But flat-out appeasement is arguably an even more dangerous decision because it opens the door to escalation and nuclear blackmail. Because what you're essentially saying is that no one that is equipped with a nuclear weapon or something equivalent can be deterred. It's the ultimate green light for acts of aggression. You can invade countries, disobey international law, whatever you want really, and no one will do anything meaningful about it because they have deterred themselves. It'd be like someone turning up to a chess tournament and saying that they were going to flip the board into your face if you didn't immediately resign. Unless someone eventually calls them on it, you might see people like Magnus Carlsen taken down by a person who may well play pawn f3 as their opening move. In that sort of scenario, countries are going to race to get their hands on nuclear weapons because they now function essentially as a get-out-of-jail-free card. And there is the more general risk, highlighted by strategists in countries like Japan, that if Russia was allowed to be successful with its invasion of Ukraine, then other countries elsewhere might have been emboldened to also try and change the status quo through the use of military force. As a result, avoiding escalation in one conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, might serve as the spark to escalate other situations elsewhere in the world in the future. Now, I don't know what happened during all of the classified behind closed doors negotiations between Ukraine's various allied states over the course of 2022. So what follows is ultimately just how I assess the situation as appearing from the outside looking in. You have a situation where most leaders are unwilling to simply leave the Ukrainians to their fate. Because to do so would not just abandon the Ukrainians to their fate, it would also be ruinous from a strategic perspective. But at the same time, many seem nervous about just declaring Russia was bluffing, sending the maximum amount of aid as quickly as possible, thus losing the support of politicians and people worried about sudden uncontrolled escalation. The risk is likely not perceived to be particularly high when it comes to economic measures or humanitarian aid. Of all the potential reasons Russia might ever attack NATO, an increase in the supply of food and medical aid to Ukrainian refugees probably isn't high on the list. Similarly, economic measures like sanctions have usually been met either by no response or economic measures in return. Russia has done things like play the energy card or prevent foreign investors from easily getting their money out of the country. But even Russian state TV, as I've seen it, is pretty short on threats of kinetic action in response to economic sanctions. Which means other than threatening things like the grain export deal, Russia doesn't have a tremendous amount of leverage left in this field. And the true dangerous red lines, if they exist, probably relate to military aid. The approach that seems to have been settled on is cautious incrementalism, sometimes called boiling the frog. Basically, after the old story that you could slowly turn up the temperature on a frog in a pot of water and it wouldn't notice that it was being cooked. I'm not a fan of the name personally, but I'm using it here because many people will recognise it. Essentially what you do is instead of making all of your potential escalations at once, you make one or two small ones. Then through things like your intelligence apparatus, you assess how your opponent responds, and thus how they're likely to respond to another small incremental escalation. One reason this process might be useful is because your opponent may themselves not know how they're going to respond until they're put in a stressful situation. So it's only as you apply gentle increases in pressure that their position on further escalation becomes knowable. And then, as you get feedback, you continue to slowly amp up the pressure. To use an analogy, imagine Colonel Kleptovsky is told to move his unit through a forest, but he isn't sure whether it's been mined or not. He could send the whole unit on an assault motion through the forest, but if it is mined, he's going to find out in a pretty dramatic fashion pretty quickly. So instead, what he might do is send Private Conscriptovich and a couple of his comrades through the forest, slowly poking the ground ahead of them with bayonets or mine detectors as they go. If they don't discover a mine, great, they keep going. But if they do discover one, they can pull back and come up with a plan for breaching the minefield they have now discovered. That might mean bringing up specialised mine clearing equipment and personnel. Or if General Muradov happens to be in command, pulling a Vuhledar 3.0 and simply running vehicles into the mines until the minefield runs out of mines. If you look at the kind of weapon systems that countries have been willing to supply to Ukraine, it's broadly followed this sort of incremental structure. It's difficult to remember now, but at the time there were voices saying that sending M777 artillery pieces, for example, might run the risk of crossing a Russian red line and uncontrolled escalation. But after those systems were sent, the way was paved for HIMARS, then main battle tanks, most recently air-launched cruise missiles, and now it looks increasingly likely that we'll see announcements on the supply of fourth-generation Western fighter jets to Ukraine in 2023. And in each case, the result of supplying one class of weapon system has helped assuage the fears and build a coalition around supplying the next one. Not just, it should be noted, in terms of escalation risk, but also in terms of proving that Ukraine has the capacity to absorb and field complex equipment. It's an interesting observation that once Western fourth-generation fighters begin to be fielded in Ukraine, the list of new high-profile capabilities that Ukraine is requesting starts to get relatively small. There might be evolutions of existing capabilities. For example, Storm Shadow could be joined by other air-launched cruise missile, F-16 could be augmented by more advanced air-to-ground or air-to-air munitions. Or it could be joined by Gripen or another Western jet. But truly new high-profile capabilities on the shopping list will become pretty few and far between, meaning that if there is a Russian red line around what sorts of weapons are provided to Ukraine, that red line exists beyond the bounds of what Ukraine's allies can practically provide. Russia would probably draw the line at giving Ukraine nuclear weapons, for example. But for Ukraine's nuclear-armed allies, such a move would be beyond the bounds of sanity and political viability anyway. This sort of incrementalism has also been deployed in terms of how weapons can be used by the Ukrainians and against what targets. After Russia claimed to annex the oblasts of Kherson and Zaporizhia, there were questions over whether or not using Western weapons in those areas would cross a Russian red line. So the idea was cautiously tested, and it turns out there wasn't. But hey, then the question went, maybe Russia didn't consider those oblasts part of Russia anyway, despite their claims, but maybe Crimea was different. But eventually that taboo too was broken. And some of Ukraine's backers made very clear they considered strikes into Crimea to be legitimate. And so for now, the red line that exists is using Western-supplied weapons against internationally recognised Russian territory. And even though it may seem unjust that Russia is able to strike freely at Kyiv, whereas the Ukrainians are not able to deploy Western weapons like Storm Shadow against recognised Russian territory, I suspect that this restriction will remain in place at least for now. But also because it makes potentially removing that restriction a strong bargaining chip when dealing with Russia. Because in terms of consequences, there's a massive difference between a squadron or two of very cheap drones with small payloads circling over the elite neighbourhoods of Moscow, and low-profile cruise missiles levelling the MOD building. One final point worth calling out when you're talking about incrementalism is actually outcomes. That is, rather than looking at what systems Ukraine receives as aid, looking at what Russia is willing to tolerate so far as defeats go. The idea that Russia might escalate to nuclear force in order to defend areas it had taken and claimed to annex, for example, was tested at Kherson, likely giving the Allies more confidence to encourage Ukraine to take back other territories that Russia claims to have annexed. Testing this makes a degree of sense given the way Russian nuclear doctrine has traditionally been written and declared. Russian nuclear doctrine has never said deploy nuclear weapons if your opponent is given more than 50 tanks built after 1980 or if they're given F-16s. It instead describes circumstances where those weapons might be used. For example, an attack that threatens to bring Russia's nuclear deterrent offline or which threatens the very survival of the Russian state. But here's the thing about even cautious incremental escalation. It requires that someone be willing to take each incremental step. And as I hinted at before, Ukraine's allies are not some hive mind. Different countries have different appetites for escalation and different capacity and preferences when it comes to providing aid. Now, I've regularly heard the Russian talking point that all European states, for example, are just puppets of the United States. To which I'd say first, those people have clearly never followed EU-US trade negotiations or read France's defence strategy. But more seriously, we can see real differences play out between Ukraine's various allies on the topic of aid and escalation. There are countries, for example, that are comfortable being first movers on providing some new novel capability or escalating in some other way. A number of countries fall into this category. The Brits, the Poles, and the Dutch all come to mind alongside others. Then you have nations that are more conservative on the topic of escalation that do not want to move first, for example, but who can nonetheless be incredibly important as aid providers. Germany probably falls into this category. The Germans have never wanted to be first or to act alone in providing a new weapon system, like tanks for example. But once that threshold was crossed, they became a critical donor and supporter. And over the last several months in particular have become ever more important providers of military aid to Ukraine. Finally, at the other extreme end of the spectrum, away from the Poles and the Brits, you even have some voices that oppose military aid in general. Hungary's Viktor Orban is probably the clearest example here. And the key thing here is your first movers do not have to necessarily be your biggest donors. Instead, their role is simply to lead the way, to be brave enough to step forward into the metaphorical forest and check whether the next escalation landmine is concealing another empty bluff or something potentially more dangerous. Once they can confirm the situation is all clear, it's much safer, practically and politically, for other major donors to follow suit, and indeed they might face increasing pressure to do so. Britain's decision to train Ukrainian troops in Britain, for example, wasn't going to change the war by itself, but it provided an impetus for other nations to join in or to start programs of their own. A handful of Challenger 2 tanks likewise isn't going to change things over much. But you could argue that the story of every Western-built main battle tank that now goes to Ukraine starts with those Challenger 2s. And as for countries like Poland or the Czech Republic, they were halfway up the escalation ladder within a couple of weeks of the war starting. No one needed to spend time having a debate about whether it was safe to send Warsaw Pact-era tanks or not, because by the time anyone knew what was happening, the heavy metal was already rolling. But that's probably enough about the Western side of the escalation calculus, because now instead I want to talk about how Russia has responded to each of these escalations in aid and support. Now, in doing this section, I do want to lead in with a caveat. I am not in the war room with Shoigu and Gerasimov. I am not a Kremlin whisperer, and I have no secret information on how they're thinking or what they're going to do next. I have previously talked about Russian nuclear doctrine, what they've actually published on the subject. But at the same time, there's nothing forcing Russia to actually follow its doctrine. At the end of the day, if Vladimir Putin wants to change the doctrine, he can. So there will always be some uncertainty over whether or not Russia will actually follow its own rules. But what I think we can do is look at how Russia has behaved so far, how they've responded to escalations in aid and support, try and figure out why they may have done so and thus how they're likely to respond in the future. As any good financial advisor will tell you, prior performance isn't a guarantee of future performance. And so there are always going to be limitations to an approach like this, but nonetheless, I think it can be useful. And so let's look at how Russia has responded to the West announcing it's going to send new weapon systems to Ukraine over the last 15 months or so. And I'm going to break the response into several standard phases. Phase 1 occurs before a weapon system has been supplied. And at this point, the goal seems to be to create the maximum possible fear around escalation. Remember, logically speaking, Russia's goal is to prevent Western countries or Ukraine's other allies from sending it any sort of new support. And one of the tools they have available to them is raising the spectre of potential nuclear escalation. And so you will often see Russian political figures like Dmitry Medvedev or propagandists suggesting that if the West sends so much as the first toothpick to Kyiv, then it may well result in the nuclear annihilation of Berlin and London. Now, in order to make those sort of fears credible, you have to make the weapon systems sound as important and as significant as possible. After all, it would be pretty non-credible to suggest that nuclear war might break out over the supply of a weapon system that doesn't have any significance. Instead, the weapon in question has to be dangerous, remarkable, a potential trigger for nuclear escalation. For example, before the decision to supply Western main battle tanks to Kyiv was taken, the State Duma chairman Vyacheslav Volodin said that the supply of more powerful weapons like MBTs to Ukraine would cause, quote, global tragedy that would destroy their countries. Going so far as to say that if Washington and NATO supplied weapons that could be used for striking cities or making attempts to seize Russian territory, noting that Russia obviously claims a significant amount of internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, then that action would trigger retaliation with, quote, more powerful weapons, end quote, wink wink. This approach hasn't just been applied to Western-built tanks or aircraft or air-launched cruise missiles. All the way back on the 27th of May 2022, we were having this discussion around the supply of artillery systems. Long before HIMARS arrived in Ukraine in an era where the longest range system that had been sent was the M777 howitzer, Sergei Lavrov was reported as saying that supplying Ukraine with weapons capable of hitting Russian territory would be a step towards, quote, unacceptable escalation. And as I said, I interpret the idea here as being making the supply of a particular weapon sound like a massive step, like a dangerous escalation that might be the spark that sets off World War III. Really, it doesn't matter how important the weapon actually is, you don't want the West supplying Ukraine with any weapons. So even though the impact of a small number of Western-built main battle tanks might not be markedly different from the hundreds of Soviet-style tanks supplied by the Czechs or the Poles, but you have to make them sound incredibly different, otherwise why would people believe that you would escalate the crisis over them? If this works, congratulations, you've successfully deterred the West. The oh shit moment, however, comes when the Brits inevitably announce that they're going to send whatever it is you told them not to send, which they've done so often that it leads me to suspect that thumbing their nose at the threats of autocrats on the continent is basically just part of British political tradition. In any case, if you're Russia, this now puts you in a bind. Up to this point, you've been suggesting that supplying artillery tanks insert weapon system here is such a dramatic step that it might spark some sort of uncontrolled escalation or retaliation, be it attacks on NATO countries or nuclear war. But for reasons we'll go through later, you don't actually want to escalate. And so the Russian response system moves to phase 2. Phase 2 occurs because your opponent has chosen to escalate, but you don't want to escalate yourself in response, and now you need to justify not doing so. You need to walk back essentially your earlier comments. And the way Russia often chooses to do this so far is taking the weapon system or sanctions package in question that was previously described in such dramatic terms, and instead now describing them as essentially a non-factor. You can say things like, this won't change anything about the current situation, this is fundamentally unimportant, or this can be readily dealt with using existing or readily available means. The reason for doing this is if something is unimportant, it would make no sense to escalate. And so through the power of a rapidly changing narrative, extremely dangerous weapons become completely inconsequential. So with that said, how did Russia respond once it was announced that Western countries were going to begin sending Western main battle tanks? Well, if you were watching Russian state media at the time, a number of narratives quickly surfaced. You could quote experts saying that Ukraine doesn't have the capacity to maintain these Western main battle tanks, so they won't make a difference on the battlefield. And even if they appear, they can be readily dealt with the anti-tank weapons that are already available at hand. You could argue that Russia has better tanks than these Western MBTs anyway, even going so far to argue that T-62M tanks can withstand Leopard 2s perfectly well. For good measure, you can add some more quotes about how easily these tanks will be destroyed. For example, you could quote the Russian Minister for Internal Affairs, where Vladimir Alexandrovich declares that the Leopard tanks from Germany will burn just like the Tigers and Panthers did in the past. Plus, you can argue tanks may not even be that great to begin with for Ukraine. And to do that, all you need to do is bring in someone like Scott Ritter to write an article in Sputnik describing heavy armour as having been outstripped by the advent of anti-armour weapons and saying the decision to provide Ukraine with Western main battle tanks is literally a suicide pact. Because for some reason, Ukraine was desperately asking for equipment that will do nothing other than increase their own casualties and hasten their defeat. To use an analogy, this is basically the phase where a wannabe pickup artist, having been rejected, starts essentially arguing that she wasn't that hot anyway, he's been with far hotter in the past, he could easily attract far hotter women than her, but also he's into men anyway and women aren't that great. Going back to tanks, if this whole process is successful, it should justify the decision not to escalate in response to the supply of equipment or the initiation of a sanctions package. In any case, it's probably time to move on to phase 3, where a thing isn't just declared to be inconsequential. Instead, it's time to declare that it has arrived or it's initiated, and it has completely failed, been destroyed, and made no difference whatsoever. So if you're talking about sanctions, this is no longer sanctions will have no effect, this is sanctions have had no effect. If you're talking about a piece of equipment, like a Bradley for example, this is no longer Bradleys will make no difference, this is Bradleys have arrived and also we've destroyed 4 of them already, even though they haven't actually arrived. This sounds silly, but from a logical perspective, there's lots of reasons that you might want to adopt this strategy from an information war perspective. At home, it might increase domestic confidence that you can deal with the systems that are arriving. Amongst your soldiers, again, it can reduce morale shocks and reduce the fear around enemy equipment. To your supporters around the world, it validates your decision not to escalate. Of course you're not escalating the conflict in response to these weapons, they have been proven to be useless. Plus, you're also probably trying to discourage further support being given in the future. Why would the UK send more Storm Shadows to Ukraine if none of them are reaching their targets and they're being shot down every day? And so you get some wonderful stories making it into the media. Like the story of a Russian sabotage group that apparently infiltrated behind Ukrainian lines, stole a Leopard 2 tank, but couldn't get it back to their lines, so they just drove it into a swamp to drown it instead. And before you ask, no, apparently they didn't photograph or film any of this, there was no relevant drone footage, and the evidence was basically trust me bro. Then there's all the claims around Patriot, where the Russian Defense Ministry reported that on May 16th it destroyed 5 Patriot missile launchers and a Patriot radar station using Kinsale missiles, with some of the reporting around this going further and claiming that literally none of the Patriot interceptors that were fired during this attacks hit their target. It doesn't matter if the evidence available suggests that this is complete bullshit. It still arguably serves a purpose. And there will of course always be those online that take these statements uncritically and report them as fact. My point is that this seems to be part of a generalized Russian playbook when it comes to a new sort of escalation from Ukraine's allies. And while it may sound silly, the same pattern has been followed often enough in relation to enough systems that I am really tempted to believe that there is a method to the apparent madness. So many times has this pattern repeated, from a system being described as a potentially catastrophic escalation to declarations being made that it has arrived, been destroyed, and it made absolutely no difference, that I'm reasonably confident we'll see the same thing happen with any announcement over F-16s going to Ukraine. From a dangerously escalatory system, I suspect F-16 will rapidly be described as a non-factor, and reports of destroyed F-16s may be on the agenda sooner rather than later. And as I said, that response cycle can apply to things other than new weapon systems. Sanctions can begin as a major threat that might cause significant Russian retaliation, to being something that won't achieve anything, to being something that has achieved nothing and will just make Russia stronger as a result. When it comes to attacks on territory that Russia claims, it can begin with a threat of massive escalation if this Russian territory is threatened. But once those attacks or advances actually eventuate, the line can become, these attacks don't mean anything, they don't change anything. In the case of an attack by missiles or drones, you can declare that the air defense destroyed everything, shot everything down. Or if you lose territory, like in Kherson, well, that was just a repositioning to more advantageous defensive positions on the other side of the Dnipro River. There are two key points to make here. The first is that even though this cycle may sound ridiculous when presented in this way, especially given that it is repeated time and time again, I'd argue that the Russian strategy here has in some ways been at least partially successful. They have in a number of cases managed to prompt genuine fears of escalation among politicians or members of the public. Even now you have cases where a majority of people or where governments oppose or are cautious about the supply of a new weapon system like ALCMs or F-16s because of some perceived escalation risk. In many cases, Russia has succeeded in making Ukraine's allies move slowly or not at all, partially deterring them despite never having to follow through. And those last few words there are also the second key takeaway. That generally speaking, while Russian politicians and media figures have often raised the spectre of uncontrolled escalation, when push comes to shove, they've usually chosen to back down and minimize the threat as opposed to escalate in response to it. And that leads us to the question of why? Why does Russia respond this way? And that's important not just for understanding why they've responded this way in the past, but also how they may respond in the future. And again, I want to stress that I don't know what's going through the heads of the Russian leadership. We can try and apply logic and theory, as we're about to do, to understanding why Russia makes the decisions it does. But it's always possible that we're wrong about the reasoning process, that the decision-making is illogical as opposed to logical. Usually a war game scenario will assume, for example, that both sides are trying to win the war as their most important objective. But you might in fact have a situation where things like regime security or personal enrichment are more important to a national leadership or elite than securing the best possible military and political outcome. But all that being said, I think there's pretty strong reasons from a logical and theoretical standpoint to suggest that Russia is always going to be very reluctant to escalate the situation. The reasoning goes back to that old concept I introduced at the start of this episode, the idea of escalation dominance. The idea that one power doesn't want to escalate the situation because they know their potential opponent has a massive advantage at those higher levels of escalation. Dave the comedian doesn't actually want to start a physical fight with Ricky the bricklayer because he'll get destroyed. And I'd argue Russia finds itself in a similarly limiting position. In the present state, Russia and Ukraine are fighting a full conventional war with each other. And no matter how far Russia escalates, Ukraine doesn't have that many macro options to respond. They could mobilize more people, they could use more desperate tactics, but Ukraine doesn't have any nuclear weapons it could suddenly choose to deploy. In any case, while this war is happening, Ukraine's various allies, so NATO plus, are supplying Ukraine with significant amounts of assistance, economic, military materiel, intelligence, etc., but they're not intervening directly. The Polish Air Force is not flying strike missions destroying Russian tanks, for example. Now, I would argue that in that present state, in that configuration where Ukraine is constantly receiving increasing amounts of aid of different types over time, that Russia is in a really difficult position. But let's pretend for a moment it doesn't really matter. You can substitute whatever you want into that advantage column. If you think Russia is currently winning and will continue to win, that's okay. Put mild Russian advantage in that box. More important, I would argue, is that there is nowhere further up the escalation chain that puts Russia in a better position than it is now. Targeting NATO directly or using tactical nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, for example, is likely to trigger a conventional NATO response at the bare minimum. And in that scenario, I strongly contend, it would be a backhand slap so loud you could hear the thing in space. Because given how we have seen Russia struggle to overcome Ukraine's capabilities and resistance, it's fanciful to think that they would be in a better position if all of the NATO plus militaries were suddenly added to the battle. Escalating to a tactical nuclear exchange with NATO doesn't provide any relief. The NATO plus alliance includes 3 nuclear powers and a diverse range of modern and up-to-date delivery systems. And at the top of the ladder, of course, there's mutually assured destruction, which is the worst possible outcome for Russia. And so from this perspective, it's actually in Russia's interest to avoid escalation almost at any cost. Instead, you could argue the Russian theory of victory likely hinges on de-escalating the conflict, not escalating it. To have any hope of beating Ukraine or being in an advantaged position, what Russia really needs to do is reduce the assistance that Ukraine is receiving, or at the very least to get itself a serious breath to rest, rearm and reorganize itself. So it needs a temporary ceasefire or for Ukraine's allies to get bored of the war. And as events like Pearl Harbor show us, directly attacking someone is not usually a good way to de-escalate the situation and promote political disengagement. And I go further and argue Russia doesn't really have a great suite of escalation options in general. It could attack NATO directly with conventional weapons, but I'm uncertain what it could hope to achieve. Trying to cut off Western supplies to Ukraine by bombing depots in Poland would be immensely counterproductive, as the various NATO countries, among other things, rapidly scheduled new air-launched weapons deliveries to Russia. There are plenty of weapon and mass destruction-based options, but those come with all of the risks and challenges we've talked about before. And Russia does have a pool of remaining mobilization options. It can call up a vast number of new men. It can try and dedicate even more of the economy towards pumping out war materiel. But there are a variety of reasons they haven't done that already, ranging from the political to the economic. And so it doesn't make much sense to begin an escalation cycle when you don't have that many good cards left to play. And those measures Russia has adopted aren't that threatening when looked at closely. The recent deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus, for example, won a lot of headlines. But in strategic terms, changed very little. The weapons are not under Belarusian control, they're under Russian control. And in terms of targets in Ukraine, Europe, or the United States, all of them were already within range of Russia's nuclear arsenal. And so I'd argue the move changes very little, and indeed what we've seen from many Western leaders is essentially condemnation of the move and then them moving on. All of Russia is in nuclear weapons range, all of Europe is in nuclear weapons range, and that's just a status quo that has prevailed since the mid-Cold War. In any case, if Russia is relying on de-escalating Western involvement, dragging out the war long enough for them to abandon Ukraine so that it can secure an advantage, I feel I need to point out that it obviously isn't guaranteed to work and carries a lot of risks. Russia may believe that political support for Ukraine is finite, it may be right, but Russian economic and military resources are likewise finite. And if it becomes clear that Western support is going to be too significant or too enduring for Russia to realistically handle, then Russia may be forced to modify its negotiating position and demands. This is why when I'm talking about evaluating how the war is likely to go, I always emphasize the pipeline. Aid that is pledged or committed, which may not arrive tomorrow or next month, but instead 1, 2, 3, or 4 years in the future. Because the more that pipeline expands, the more signals are sent to Russia that holding on and waiting for all the Western aid to go away is not going to be a viable solution. Now, obviously, pushing Russia towards a less favourable outcome for them is never going to be without risk. But from the perspective of many of Ukraine's Western allies, backing down would be even more risky, inviting more nuclear proliferation and blackmail, new security threats, and significant challenges to what is often called the rules-based international order. I'd argue that history and theory both suggest that Russia is unlikely to escalate if put in a more difficult military position, that it is absolutely possible to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia if the will and resources are there to do so. But I think it's also worth pointing out that if Russia does choose to escalate, the most likely target for that escalation will be those who cannot easily escalate in response. That is, most Russian military escalation options are going to target the Ukrainians, not the NATO powers. This is the risk that you sometimes hear commentators talk about when they say that supplying weapons may prolong the war or increase casualties. The casualties in question are likely to be Russian and Ukrainian. And as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, they've made very clear that that is a risk they are willing to take, rather than yield to Russian territorial demands. Which brings us to our final segment where we start to look forward and ask the question of how has aid and support from Ukraine's allies escalated over the last few months and what is it likely to do going forward? Escalation decisions relating to aid, like any escalation decision, should be related to strategic goals. This isn't a level up system where you get bonus points if you speed run your way to the brink of nuclear war. Escalation decisions are also only one factor in how this conflict is likely to play out. Military performance or diplomatic developments, for example, are obviously going to be critical. But if you're just looking at escalation and aid, then both sides probably need something different for their respective theories of victory to become credible. Russia would probably greatly benefit if aid de-escalated and slowed down. In the long run, matching the full financial and economic resources of the Western powers is just a non-starter as an idea. And so it will need to encourage Ukraine's allies to step back. Ukraine, meanwhile, is going to want them to go further, both in terms of what is being provided and also the quantity and pipeline involved. In terms of major escalation points, a significant number have been cleared already. The first movers have charged forward and in most cases found nothing but bluff. In economic terms, asset freezes and the oil price cap have just become a fact of life. Western weapons are now allowed to be used on the territory of Crimea, and we're getting close to Ukraine receiving one of the last major platform types that it desperately needs, a Western 4th generation fighter. So while the incrementalism of the last 15 or so months has probably been very difficult for the Ukrainians, who have had to campaign heavily for each sequential escalation, there are probably fewer high-profile lines left to cross in 2023 than there were in 2022. And beyond just steady incrementalism, I suspect that might also indicate a change in relations between Ukraine and its allies. Deciding to supply weapons systems to a country usually requires that a degree of trust be in place to avoid unpleasant incidents, and that trust can be very easily undermined. If you hand your child a stick and tell them not to hit their brother and the first thing they do is start chasing them around the yard trying to belt them, your next step is probably not to hand the kid a hammer. In Ukraine, the key point of trust is around how Ukraine will use the weapons it is supplied. Ukraine's allies have generally made it pretty clear that they do not want weapon systems they supplied being used to hit recognised Russian territory. But what has changed is how they've tried to ensure Ukraine doesn't do so. In March, for example, the US was only supplying cannon artillery. That had a comparatively limited range, so meaningful attacks into Russian territory would be difficult. Then when HIMARS began arriving, reports are that these systems were modified so that they physically could not be used to fire long-range missiles into Russia. That was a little riskier than providing the howitzers because it was hypothetically possible that Ukrainian software engineers would manage to crack the case and reprogram the systems, but it was still much more secure than just taking the Ukrainians at their word. Cut forward to May, and the British and potentially others are providing air-launched cruise missiles, again under the assurance that they won't be used against Russian territory. We don't know if these too have been physically modified to make attacks on Russian territory impossible, but the public emphasis has instead been on Ukraine's public undertaking not to use those weapons other than in the manner agreed. And if Ukraine does get Western jets, then that public commitment is probably going to be the only thing stopping them being used within Russia. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing to stop the pilot turning off the autopilot, pointing his nose at Moscow and gunning it. But the Allies increasingly trust Ukraine, it seems, not to do so. That obviously makes a degree of sense. Ukraine doesn't want to endanger its critical supply of Western support. And so going back on any agreement would be monumentally stupid. but it still represents a change in risk management approach by Ukraine's allies, from one built on physical limitations to one built on mutual trust. And that shift is likely to be reflected on an ongoing basis in the weapons that Ukraine is provided by its various allies, provided, of course, that trust is never broken. Even though these changes are massively beneficial to Ukraine, none of them appear to have hit any of Russia's red lines or triggered uncontrolled escalation, which might lead to some asking the question of whether or not Russia has any red lines at all, and if they do, where they are. For obvious reasons, Russia hasn't been quick to set down clear and unambiguous lines publicly. Because if you tell me that you'll retaliate if I do X, then the next thing I'm going to do is X minus 1. So while we have seen things like Putin clarifying late last year that Russia wouldn't be the first power to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, overall we're mostly left speculating. Speaking in February 2023, for example, Dr. Alexei Arbatov outlined 2 Russian red lines. These were essentially tacit or explicit agreements that NATO would not use its troops directly in Ukraine and Russia would refrain from striking NATO countries in return. And that secondly, NATO would not supply long-range missiles capable of striking deep within the Russian Federation. Now those seem to make sense, they seem to be relatively coherent, but it's important to remember Arbatov was part of the negotiating team for the Soviet Union on several disarmament treaties with the United States, but he is absolutely not a member of the Russian government. So I really can't provide you a definitive answer on where Russia's red lines are likely to be. All I can suggest is that historical examples, our experience so far, and the logic of escalation all suggest the line is probably somewhere far beyond what it would take for Ukraine to reclaim its territory. Because unless escalation increases rather than decreases the odds of the Russian regime surviving, which is generally speaking pretty hard to imagine, a rapid or uncontrolled escalation wouldn't make much sense. NATO troops on the way to Moscow or nuclear weapons for Ukraine would probably do it. But Ukrainians flying F-16s will almost certainly be responded to the way every other weapon system provided so far has been, with dismissal and claims of destruction rather than rapid escalation. By contrast, what Ukraine will likely be looking for is sufficient economic aid to continue as long as the war persists, and as much military assistance as possible to defend its territory, help it reclaim occupied regions, and to place as much military pressure on Russia as possible to back off its current maximalist war aims. Realistically, that means trying to make the war as costly and unproductive as possible for Russia, trying to inflict attrition, battlefield defeats, or creating hard-to-answer political and economic questions, like why smoking accidents have suddenly become so common in Russian industrial structures and draft offices. But it also means convincing Russia that Western support isn't going anywhere, and that this is not a war the Kremlin can just grind out to a favourable conclusion. That's why when I eventually give a nation-by-nation look at the strategy of many Western nations in Ukraine, I'm going to put more emphasis on the fact that many are now choosing to structure their aid as multi-year packages. Germany and Norway, for example, now both have plans in place that stretch beyond 2025, and I expect the European Union will eventually get there too. This, coupled with building up defence industrial capacity, is vitally important, because both provide signals that aid will be growing and consistent. The slow incremental process of getting to this point has no doubt been extremely frustrating for the Ukrainians. It's almost certain that fewer Ukrainian soldiers would have died or that more territory would have been reclaimed if all of these aid measures were put in place sooner. Similarly, there's probably still a long way to go on quantities and industrial production, areas where Russia will no doubt be pushing to increase figures on its side as well. But the precedent has been set that aid can be pledged or locked in for the long term without risking uncontrolled escalation. And I suspect we will see some very interesting announcements through the rest of 2023. In conclusion, escalation management is both a matter of logic, theory, and incentives on one hand, and also an understanding of the potentially illogical behaviour of humans on the other. Since the mid-Cold War, uncontrolled escalation between nuclear powers or nuclear power blocks has been the domain of mutually assured destruction and thus worth avoiding for both sides. But logic and history have also shown that it's strategically untenable to simply appease every nuclear power that makes an outlandish demand, and that through the use of tools like aid and incremental escalation and pressure, It's possible to inflict strategic defeats on nuclear powers without causing nuclear escalation. In Ukraine, a fear of escalation has probably not been the only thing causing Ukrainians to go slow with the aid approved. But over the course of 2022 and 2023 to date, many of those fears around particular escalations like providing new weapon systems have been overcome one by one. There are still some taboos that need to be broken if Ukraine is to receive everything it's requested, but NATO's position of potential escalation dominance is likely to serve as a brake on any massive escalation by the Kremlin. From that perspective, you could argue the Kremlin is playing a very weak hand, gambling more on a change in Western political sentiments than any sort of decisive military victory. Only time will tell whether that turns out to be a worthwhile strategy or simple wishful thinking. Okay, channel update to close out. First of all, thanks to everyone who voted in the poll that saw me produce this topic. I know it's somewhat theoretical in nature, but I felt it was deeply relevant, and I do hope you all got something out of the presentation. I'm currently working on a few things, firstly trying to get ahead of schedule on producing these so that I have time to get them subtitled before release, ideally. In any case, as always, I wish you all the best, and I'll see you all again next week.